Welcome, colleagues, to our last presentation, not only for the day, but for the 4-day conference. And we are privileged to have Helen Beetham giving us this final keynote presentation. I see that we are 58 in the room and people are still coming in, but I suggest we just get going so that we make savings on time. Before I hand over the floor to Helen, let me introduce her briefly. Helen Beetham is a digital education writer, researcher, and commentator. She has developed a number of digital capability frameworks that are in use around the world and contributed to both the European Union's DigiComp Edu framework for educators and the C Delta curriculum for digital leaders developed in South Africa. She has edited a number of books on the digital curriculum and works for the global universities and international organizations. Helen is currently researching digital capabilities and critical thinking in higher education. So we are very privileged to have such a person like Helen giving us this keynote address. Let me remind you that if you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the Q&A space. We will also have a 15-minute discussion session after the actual presentation. And in that session, people can raise up their hands and ask whatever questions they have. Thank you very much. Let me hand over to you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Ephraim. It's lovely to be here with you. I just want to check that you can see my slides okay before I set off with them.
Yes, Helen, we can see them very clearly. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So it's amazing to be here, and I wish I could have spent more of the conference with you. I think the weather in the UK is probably kind of quite similar to a South African winter in the middle of our summer at the moment. And when Alan and the programme committee asked me to do this, at first I was not very keen at all, and I said, I have some ambivalence about talking about capability frameworks, especially because my experience tells me that one shouldn't speak out of one context as though the materials and frameworks will work in another one. And Alan said, oh, just say that, and that'll be fine, that'll go down well. So I plan to say that and other things as well. And I want to frame the talk today around kind of 4 areas. And as Ephraim has said, very much give some floor time over to you to not just ask questions, but make your own contributions from your expertise and your expert experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about digital capabilities, particularly in the context of a kind of human capabilities approach to them. And then I'm going to say a little bit about frameworks, how they can be useful when they're not useful, how we might all be involved in developing kind of a shared understanding of digital capability. If we've got time, I want to go through a sort of little bit of a provocation about digital thinking and how it might be changing and challenging what we think of as university forms of thinking. Of course, there are many challenges underway to university thinking at the moment, and this has to find its place among them. And finish really by handing over to you to think about digital capabilities in the future. So thinking to what I have to bring, and I'll just say briefly that I don't plan to go into detail with any of these frameworks. There are lots of links I can share through the programme committee after the session that I will share, and you may also have links you want to share in the chat window. This is really about listening to the story and sharing the materials and resources we have in more detail when we have time to look at it in detail. So I hope that won't be frustrating to you. But back in around 2008, I was asked to look into this issue of what we then called digital literacy in the UK. And with colleagues, Alison Littlejohn and Lou McGill and others, we did a review of what was going on. And we concluded that we needed a definition that we could work with, which we came up with this one, which has been very robust, at least in the UK, which is about the capabilities needed to live, learn and work in a digital society. Of course, that begs the question, what kind of digital society? There isn't only one of them, and we're all in the process of helping to shape what that digital society will be. But we felt very clear that having or not having access to, having less access to some of these capabilities was going to have a lifelong and life-wide impact for individuals and for their communities as well. Now, as soon as you define something, people want a framework for thinking about it. And we started out with a framework for education. And I've been really lucky to be involved in developing frameworks for the healthcare sector, also for the heritage sector in the UK, which is our museums and our art galleries and all those very problematic parts of our culture that we are all trying to question at the moment and treat as unfixed and as open to negotiation and change through history and politics. And also, as Ephraim said, I was lucky enough to be involved in a EU framework and, of course, the Great Sea Delta project run at the University of Cape Town. And what I've learned through doing all of those frameworks and others that I've been very, very delighted to get engaged with is that what it means to live, learn and work, or to live, learn and work well, to thrive, which is another part of our definition, it means very different things. And people, of course, even within a culture have very different resources for realising their own personal thriving and their community thriving. So those experiences led me to prefer the term capabilities over literacies, and I'm happy to say more if people want to question me about the exact terms, and I will say a bit more about human capability. But what do I think talking about capabilities helps us to do? Well, I think it means we're thinking about technologies and techniques in the hands of learners or workers or citizens, if we're thinking about those other spheres. We're not thinking about a top-down approach where we put systems in place and train you to use them. We're acknowledging that skills are already there within different practices of knowledge, within different cultures. We're saying that digital capabilities are, it's not a deficit model. Students have their own knowledge cultures, including these days their own digital cultures, which may be very different from the academic digital culture. And so we're not adding something on, we are negotiating something with existing knowledge practices and cultures that are there. And even within digital, of course, there are very many different ways of being digitally capable. There are subject differences, there are sector differences, there are cultural differences. And that question of what it means to thrive is always there at the back when we're having those negotiations with people. Now, for me, I'm delighted to be able to relate to some of you in South Africa around the question of human capabilities, because people like Melanie Walker have done so much amazing work from a South African context around human capability. And two books that are on this slide, particularly that Melanie has co-authored, I would recommend to anyone who's interested in the background to the idea of human capability. And I also think this speaks very clearly to what Laura Rendon was saying yesterday about educating for wholeness and social justice and liberation. Of course, Amartya Sen's kind of founding texts around human capability talked about development as freedom and as liberation. So there's lots of resources around human capability that I draw on in thinking about digital capability. So, for example, in her most recent book, Melanie Walker talks about social and educational capabilities, being resources expanding people's capabilities. And it's not just about what you kind of have as a skill, but it's about the opportunities you have to be and to do in ways that are valuable to you as a person. De Sousa Santos, who's also done a lot of work in this, prioritises the university as a place for human capability. And he says it's a place where we need to negotiate the kind of knowledge that we're going to produce, the kind of knowledge practices we're going to engage in. And we do that in the university through this very privileged space we have for open and critical discussion. And lastly, the great and late, sadly, Harry Garuba talked about the curriculum as a place where we need to think about what kinds of future people are moving into and what kinds of people might need to thrive in that, we can create to thrive in that future, that they need to think about the future in particular ways. So we need people who are thinking. So this is where I get my idea of digital capabilities, which is widely shared as being about ways of thinking, and that those are negotiated locally. They are very much linked to the idea of sustainability and social justice, because that's the only way that we can work together in a democratic and just way to negotiate what forms of knowledge matter. And there's always a question mark over what kinds of knowledge practice are relevant here, now, might be relevant in the future, which are also questions about what kind of future we want. So in short, I think digital capability is a very large set of questions. It's questions about knowledge, and it's questions about future, and it's also questions about the future of the university. Now, the uses and limits of frameworks. So I have helped to develop a number of frameworks. I use frameworks. There are a plethora of frameworks around digital capability, and if you've looked into this at all, you may find them quite confusing. I would simply say that what's valuable is the process of developing a framework as a shared language for understanding the space. So, for example, when I was developing a framework for the UK education sector, for me, it was very important to think about critical use, not just about receiving messages in digital media, but about how we receive them critically from our own perspective of what critique means. Also about creative practice, but for today's talk, I wanted to focus on critique. And also I talked about wellness, and digital well-being and wellness has become very mainstream, and I know has in the context you're working in as well. But back in 2010, it was an odd thing to bring into the sphere of digital, and one that raised quite a lot of controversy and quite a lot of eyebrows. And again, was a starting point for some really interesting conversations, which is all a framework really at the end of the day can be. That framework focused on learners. There are also frameworks focusing on teachers. Ephraim mentioned the EU one. And again, a big part of that framework is thinking about what role teachers play in empowering learners, not giving learners things, not building on a blank slate, but actually empowering learners to define for themselves what digital practices are meaningful, what digital practices will help them to thrive, and then supporting them to come into kind of meaningful relationships with each other, with knowledgeable other people, with digital resources to develop and be empowered to develop their own kind of thinking. But as I keep emphasizing, a framework doesn't do that. A framework doesn't empower anybody. A framework doesn't make anyone more able to critique. To do that, you need to use a framework and make it actionable in practice. And I think a thing a framework can do is share some of those resources, because otherwise it just becomes another demand on busy and stressed teaching staff. It's another checklist. Have you done your digital? Have you put that in the curriculum? We really need these shared resources of understanding so that teachers aren't left on their own with this huge conundrum that I've opened up. So, for example, in the EU, we have various self-assessment tools that are used across schools by teachers, very democratically by students, by school leaders, and they've been very carefully negotiated. So within Europe, there is a somewhat common culture of schooling which has been negotiated very carefully through developing these resources. But that's not to say it's a universal culture of schooling. It's a European culture of schooling within which some of these resources make sense and have been productive and have enhanced the democratic capacity of learners to be involved in their own digital learning. And another thing we can do is we can share kind of curriculum resources. So here is part of a workshop that I run on sharing critical digital activities. And each of these is an activity that teaching professionals can explore. They can add their own. They can, but it's color coded in this case to a particular capability framework. And it just means that you can share, you can kind of see where there are gaps. You can encourage people to share things that are productive where there are gaps in their understanding. And of course, once again, the great curriculum that C Delta produced is an element of a kind of shared curriculum in a very different context, in a Commonwealth context. So there's great ways that frameworks can help us to share an understanding, to share a vocabulary, just to bring the word empowerment into the room when we're talking about digital is a powerful thing. But they don't work until we start to operationalize them. And for me, that's where some of the problems can emerge. So this is a global agenda now. You'll be well aware that all of these global organizations and others have frameworks for digital capability. They all talk about digital capability as an economic driver, as part of a global agenda for the way the global economy should be moving, as well as empowering individuals. And of course, great work has been done to empower individuals. But once you get to that global level, then you can have issues like international reports and league tables, which begin to kind of compare one knowledge culture, one country's education system against another. And you'll have gathered from what I've said so far that I don't always think that is a very helpful thing to do. So there is now part of the OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment that many of you may know, which looks at what they call problem solving in digitally rich environments, and that has a league table associated with it. And I'm not even going to tell you who's on the league table, but you can probably imagine who gets to be at the top of that league table. And it's very much an issue about access to resources. It's not about negotiating in context different cultures of knowledge and what they might have to bring. Okay, so let's go back to my contention that what it means to live and learn and work and thrive is different in different settings, in different countries, in different cultures, and that within cultures we might have very different ideas ourselves about what thriving looks like, and different personal resources to bring that thriving into being for ourselves in our lives. And that's what's led me to prefer the term capability, but it's also led me to focus on the ways that things are changing, because a framework tends to fix things in time. And yet all of these things, living, learning and working, are hugely changed, not just by technologies. I'm not a technical determinist, but technologies are part of some profound changes that are going on. So of course, I don't need to tell you that we're living through a global shock, and there are other global shocks coming over the horizon, and we are unequally resourced to deal with those. But one of the ways we do deal with them is by building social resilience. And I think it's been very clear in different parts of the world that not only are we very differently resourced in terms of our access to medical resources, but we also have different forms of social resilience or lack of resilience. And sometimes digital media have played a very large role in a lack of social resilience and social responsiveness to essential public health messages. But on the positive side, you know, I've been very involved, as many of you have no doubt, in my community, in building resources, in looking after people, and that the digital technology has been invaluable. We couldn't have done a lot of the caring for people, a lot of the delivering medicines that we've done if we didn't have WhatsApp, if we didn't have some of these resources. So there are new ways that we can build resilience using digital, but there's also new ways that digital can compromise our societies and our capacity to build resilience. When it comes to working, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, we are all facing, whatever culture we live in, because it's a global economy, we are all facing a tsunami of automation. And we've had automation in kind of physical labour for many, many years. And we're now facing automation in cognitive labour. So lots of routine administrative tasks are being taken over to some extent by non-human agents. By AIs, by bots. And of course, we all need to be very careful about how those are developed, the ethics behind them. And some of those developments are creating new kinds of resistance and new kinds of organisation. Or workers organising, for example, in the UK, we have had digital picket lines where gig economy workers have organised against changes to their terms and conditions in a purely digital way, and it's been extremely effective. So there are global forces towards thriving, there are global forces against thriving, there are new ways we can organise with and against the digital, which are in our hands, I would suggest, to determine the outcomes of. And finally, of course, learning, which is where we're all situated, but in relation to those other areas of living and working, we are all learners in this incredibly super abundant information world. And that means we have to think about knowledge in a really different way. We have to be very discriminating. We have to understand there are very persuasive messages out there, some of them coming from positions of great authority, some of them coming from positions of very powerful opinion, which might not have established authority, but is very effective in our lives. And there's going to be this lifelong demand for us to deal with that. But alongside a kind of lifelong demand for us to constantly be upgrading our skills, there's lots of community initiatives around learning that I'm sure, again, you've heard of in some of the presentations that I know I've been able to see in your programme, around learning not just being a kind of positioning you in the global economy, but learning being a community-based activity that builds resilience within a whole community for these kinds of uncertainty that we're facing. So in uncertain times, the ideas of the university being able to complete your education, to fulfill all the needs you're ever going to have to be digitally able, to be intellectually able, I think they kind of have to go out of the window, because the university's claims to do that are looking very shaky. And they're not just looking shaky from all sorts of political angles as well. They're also looking shaky from this angle of the uncertainties about what forms of knowledge we're going to be practicing and what forms of knowledge are going to be powerful. So I'm just going to go back. I mean, this is this is Erasmus that I've put up there, and I'm very conscious of the context of putting dead white men with large volumes of authoritative knowledge in their hands up as a statue. We are all overturning those statues in many ways, but certainly the university that I was educated in was very much in this tradition of long form essay writing, reading very big books, and that was what knowledge looked like. That's what we would always look like. That's we could make a statue to that form of knowledge, and it was never going to change. And I want to suggest that actually digital capabilities themselves, quite apart from other political movements that are shaking the foundations of what it means to be knowledgeable, they also have their challenge to make. Now, I don't want to dwell in great detail on all of these next 5 slides. They are my current research. I'm very happy to talk more about it. But what I'm doing currently is talking to academics about these new modes of thinking, particularly how they affect students, how they affect their subject discipline, and how they're challenging some kind of ways of thinking that are current in the university. And an obvious one would be computational thinking. So we're very familiar with the fact that there are such things as algorithms in the world, and some of you may even have coding as part of what you consider to be a rounded curriculum. You may do things like hackathons and design sprints. But I'm also really aware that access to those forms of knowledge is very privileged and it can be very expensive. But you can also do what I would call paper prototyping. So something I do with students a lot is to get them to think about the kinds of apps and the kinds of algorithms that would make their lives better as students, and to paper prototype those, to write them down, to share them. They don't have to be coders. They don't have to have access to all the amazing resources of coding that, although I can see people in the chat window putting them up. And absolutely, so, you know, code is biased, algorithms are biased. We can't deal with that unless people with different cultural and knowledge backgrounds are coding. Absolutely, I'm absolutely in favour of girl coding camps, of all kinds of coding camps, but not everyone has access to those. And so if you understand how algorithms work, you can still take part in a coding camp and you can paper prototype the kinds of algorithms that you think would make your life or your community's life better. And something that guides my thinking around here is Douglas Rushkoff wrote an amazing book about 10 years ago now called Program or Be Programmed. And the argument he was making in that book is, if we are not giving our students the capacity to get under the bonnet, to get under the hood of the technology and how it works and how the codes work, it's going to be very difficult for them to understand the impact it's having on them. It will be very difficult to see the impact. So if we're not going to let ourselves be coded by other people, just using their programs, using their algorithms, dealing downstream with the outcomes of them, we have to engage, and we have to engage our students with these ways of thinking, with whatever resources we have available to do that. And they will be, I'm sure, from the people at this conference, those resources will be deployed very critically and with a great awareness of bias and inequality. Now, beyond coding, there are other kinds of database thinking that students typically want to be involved with and understand they need to be involved with in order to function in a kind of database-based society and economy. And again, this is a place where non-human agents are doing a lot of the analysis for us. But there are still some very, very human capabilities that are necessary in the database world. Seeing patterns in data, choosing how our personal data gets used, whether we give our data, whether we keep our data, whether in learning analytics we like to see our data used to help us progress, to help our teachers understand where we're up to. We don't want it used necessarily to discipline us or to manage our behaviour in other ways we haven't consented to. And so as human beings in this database world, we need all those skills. And it was great to see that Sadie had lots of workshops around data literacy. And I put up this quote from a colleague from the Open Data Institute, who talks about how, yes, again, just as with coding, we need those people, the next generation of people who understand the data from the inside out. But we also need people who maybe don't have those finely tuned and specialist skills, but can critique the impact that it's having on us as human beings to be in a data-driven world, and a world where our privacy is compromised, or where data-based algorithms could be making judgments about us that are unfair, that are biased, and that we haven't even seen them happening. Behind all of that, there's kind of forms of design-based thinking. And this is where I think the sort of challenges to the university's focus on text and on familiar kind of book-based learning is actually quite exciting, because design-based thinking is all about applied knowledge. It's about solving real-world problems, and they could be very, very local problems indeed. A great designer called Vu Quan Nguyen Mas has actually kind of proposed that in the old school kind of Enlightenment European university, philosophy was up at the apex of all the disciplines. You know, we all had to bow down to philosophy because it was the most disembodied form of knowledge we could imagine. But today we are much more turned on by and excited by applied knowledge, and applied knowledge is actually much more democratic. It's user-centered, it's about real-world local problems, and maybe this is the most important kind of overriding discipline in the new age. And if we start to think about digital making, we also then start to think about other kinds of making too. So I've shared on the screen at the minute one of the design boards that I use when I work with educators, because I find if I'm talking to educators about the sort of things I'm talking about here, about values, about how to put values into pedagogic models, and about how that all translates into activities and timelines in the curriculum, I want to use a very visual space, and they want to use it too. So there's lots of ways that design spaces can be really kind of revolutionary when it comes to thinking about the curriculum, disrupting the curriculum. You know, in a design space, you can literally take something up and just throw it away. You can, you don't have to use words about it. I'm just going to take this thing in the curriculum that doesn't work for me. I'm going to throw it away and I'm going to put something else in there. It's a really powerful and fast way of doing development that when you want radical change. And the other thing I've put up there, courtesy of my friend Frances Bell from the FemEd Tech Network, which is a network of feminists working in education and technology that she and I helped to found some years ago. One of the projects of last year for this global network of feminists was to create a real world quilt. It's called the Quilt of Justice and Care, and you can find it online. And every square in that quilt, some of which came from South Africa and other African nations to join together, every square in that quilt has a digital story that sits behind it. And you can see when you click on those links that there's a piece of digital making, of digital storytelling that went behind the piece of real world, physical, literal stitching and making. And these are kind of some of the ways that we can coexist as digital and material beings and stitch together those aspects of our world and be critical in both of them, be critical in both of them. And lastly, of course, when we think about digital, we think very much about media and the media that we're going to use to present our ideas in. And of course, in the European Enlightenment University, first of all, there was an oral tradition, and then everything went over to text and written text. But one of the interesting and exciting things about new media is I think that we're looking at a new kind of culture of orality. I don't know if you have teenagers, but my teenagers, they don't text very much to each other. They certainly don't email. They send each other little snippets of video with a little message or a little audio. It doesn't have to pass through that textual medium for them to communicate quite, in ways that they find fun and engaging. But increasingly also, we're communicating really serious academic ideas in ways that are not passing through the medium of the text and the peer-reviewed journal. Videos, for example, podcasts, all of these you will have used and I use to educate myself and to share ideas with other people. So we're no longer stuck in a world where everything has to pass through the medium of text. And we're in a world where sometimes sensory richness can be perhaps valued in ways that it wasn't in that university with the statue with the big book. And Gunter Kress, who's done a lot of work, the late Gunter Kress, done a lot of work on what this means in terms of teaching. He said, we are in this world where constantly this choice is available. Shall I express this in music? Shall I express it verbally? All through the medium of the screen, but there are all these different modes and media available to us, which are challenging the privilege of text and the privilege of certain forms of thinking. Most radically, I guess, with immersive technologies. Now, I use very, very low-tech versions like GatherTown and Minecraft making to do this kind of thing. But we are increasingly in a digital world where we can take on other people's points of view, we can take on other identities, we can play those out in real and virtual ways, in incredibly sensory rich ways. We can communicate through gesture, for example, in ways that might have been valued in pre-print cultures, and we can maybe begin to bring back and wonder, well, what would it be like if we communicated a bit more gesturally in our present digital culture. That has been an absolute whistle-stop tour through, I'm aware, some really big ideas, and I don't want to overwhelm. I want to get back to my main point, but I just wanted to show that some of what I'm thinking of, some of what I'm saying about digital capability presents in its way a really significant challenge to the ways of knowledge, the ways of thinking that prevailed for a long time and continue to prevail at the university. I'm not beginning to pretend, though, that the kinds of challenge that come from digital to the established ways of thinking are the same, or we should think of them in the same way as kind of movements around decolonisation, for example, because all those digital ways of thinking that I've just been so enthusiastic about and presented to you so enthusiastically, they, of course, are incredibly powerful and would be hegemonic, would be dominating forms of knowledge. So Silicon Valley, there's Elon Musk on the left looking at a live white guy, looking at a dead white guy and saying that, you know, we are going to disrupt you. We are going to disrupt you. We have got all sorts of disruptions in store to sweep away academic ways of knowing alongside minority cultural and knowledge practices. We don't care. We are not going to be we're not going to be democratic about how these forms of knowledge are distributed. You know, we are not a democratic disruption. We are a market-driven disruption. And some of the ways the university has actually found through a long struggle of being democratic about knowledge may be swept away alongside all the things we don't like about the established European university. That's not, of course, determined, but we're in charge of that. So what I would say is that our values and not the technology are going to determine what is valued in the future and what our relationship with technology will be. And I just want to finish with three things. I want to say what I see through this program, this conference, what you're doing is very much in tune with the idea that we should value the human and value human ways of thinking. If there is jobs that technology can do, let the technology do it. Let's have jobs that are fit for human beings to do. The UK Office of National Statistics did this rather lovely piece of analysis where it looked at how much at risk different jobs were of being automated, and the yellow spot that you may be able to see right at the low risk end, that's a secondary school teacher. And I think the dot just on the other side of it may be an academic teacher. So, you know, teaching, the task of teaching is not very vulnerable. And that's because teaching is a deeply relational and democratic thing to do. It's not just a set of tools in a toolbox that a really expert AI can pick up and deliver just as well. I think there's a focus on well-being. We've learned in the last year, if we've learned anything at all, that education rests on well-being and health and shared access to what keeps us well. And I'm saying that from the very privileged position of being double vaccinated in a society that has access to those resources of health and well-being that's allowed us to keep people educating. But we have begun to understand, thank God, that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And this is true of learning too. Nobody is educated enough until everybody is educated to participate equally in a shared knowledge culture. And the framework I showed you at the beginning that focused in my framework that focused on criticality and well-being, well, the framework that the World Economic Forum, no less, has just expressed its support for also has in there well-being, empathy, and critical thinking. You know, change can happen.
Helen, sorry to interrupt. If you could wind up, please, so that
I
we
will
can
wind up.
entertain a few questions.
I will wind up and take some questions. So you've talked in this conference a lot about pedagogies of care and justice. I would want to add pedagogies of critique and resistance to that. We have our own student movement. And I'd want to leave you with the thought that what kind of future we have with technology is very much down to us. How we can prepare our students for that is down to them and our relationships with them. And I'm very keen to hear what you have to say about some of the provocations I've put in front of you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Let me invite questions. So far, I see there is one question in the Q&A space, and it is, are the self-assessment tools open education resources?
They are open, but well, so are they open? They are open and distributed within a European schools context, and all the resources are available outside of that context, absolutely. I think what I would want to be more widely shared, though, was the process we went through to develop them, which was a very democratic and participative process. So we invited school students, we invited school teachers, and we invited school leaders and experts to talk to us about the kinds of capability that they thought were important in the school system. And of course, the students said completely different things to the teachers, who said completely different things to the school leaders. And then we developed a resource that was very self-directed. So we wanted to make sure that it wasn't used for testing. It wasn't used for putting people in boxes. It was used for helping people to think about the digital practices they already had, the ones they enjoyed using, the ones they wanted to develop further. So one of the things that I do now is I do workshops with people who want to develop resources of that kind. I tend not to bring the resource and say, here's one we did earlier, because that's not necessarily appropriate and it's not necessarily contextual. I'll share links to all of those resources that are people have an interest in.
Thanks very much, Helen. Any more questions? What I have there is a comment rather than a question. An excellent, compelling, thought-provoking presentation which resonates deeply. Thank you, Helen. Any more questions?
I'm very moved by that. Thank you.
Yes, I can see Alan's hand is up. Alan, unmute yourself and speak.
Yes, thank you so much for talking about these digital ways in context that they are really mediating tools in a Vygotskian sense. And for me, this has been very interesting to listen to all the kinds of talks that we have, because the things that you are mentioning are really the ways in which we think that teaching should change. So when you talk about design thinking, it's not only about the people who make the frameworks. Do you include the participants in your design thinking processes? So the students or if you could talk a little bit about those kinds of interactions.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I'm aware there's so much more we could say about design thinking. So I talked in quite a theoretical way about how I think applied knowledge is really powerful in the curriculum. And I've mentioned doing it, but haven't illustrated how one can build something like a framework or a curriculum collaboratively. So I do think, and I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, that the reason I showed that design space, which is it's actually called Miro, but there are lots of design spaces. Mural is a more open source and freely available one. There are lots of design spaces one can use. Let's speak for the first instance about teaching staff as participants before we talk about students as designers. There are lots of design spaces which create a very democratic, empty and open canvas into which everybody is free to express the designs they want to express. And by using visual tools, and a lot of these canvases also support chat, and they also support live discussion. So they create a space in which, however you like to participate, whether you're someone who likes to type or speak, or if you're a quiet person and you just want to push coloured bits of paper around, all of those people can come together and create something. And so there's something from the first moment, something new appears that was not there before. And that's very powerful for if you're trying to give people the sense. So I work with students a lot with this kind of space, and not infrequently I'm working at the minute on a standard for online learning that's being applied across colleges and universities in the UK, which is designed by students. It's their message to their universities and colleges to say, this is what we really want to see you do. And there's a moment about 5 minutes in when students go, is this the real thing we're making here? And I go, yeah, this is the real thing. So we're allowed to mess with it. I go, yeah, you can do what you like with it. And there's a hugely powerful, there's a hugely powerful message there that we're not giving you a document and saying, what do you think of this document? We're saying there's an open space here in which you can enter on a completely equal footing and create something fresh that never existed before you came into it. Now, I'm not a technical determinist. I don't think the technology solves the problems. People come into that space differently empowered, differently confident, different feeling, as my comment just illustrated, feeling differently able to make their voices heard. But there are things we can do with consciousness, with intent, with political and democratic intent with the technology that opens up more space for democratic participation. And that's why I get excited about design thinking. I don't know if that answers your question. We could talk Vygotsky, but I don't know who else wants to. Alan, very happy to.
No, I don't think we want to talk about Vygotsky. It was just that I always think that a tool is something that is mutable within the context that you use it. So maybe the designer thought of it of one way, but you can twist and turn it all ways, and it's all about the way you think.
Okay, thank you. There's another question in the Q&A space. It's from Stephen Marquardt. Text is a great leveler in that it's easy to access, transmit, and search for example. What might we be losing with forms of knowledge and representation that bypass text completely? Are we shutting out some types of access or users?
Oh, such a good comment. I mean, I think the comment kind of answers itself. Yes, of course. Of course, I am not one of these kind of, I hope I've not come across as one of these kind of tech promoters who says, oh, as long as everyone's using an immersive environment, we can all learn it. No, I mean, I absolutely believe in the basic tools used in creative ways. And of course, that's what's most accessible. But I also think that as educators, so for example, I'll give you an example. One of the things that I've been discussing with academics who have participants in low access, low bandwidth parts of the world is around doing role plays. Because of course there's this grief, we're all suffering this grief at the moment of not having the physical contact with our students, with our teachers, with, you know, not being bodies in a shared room together. I mean, I've got my cup of tea, you've got yours, but there's no, and so role play can be a great way to kind of become a bit more human in the learning we have to do. And of course, there's amazing simulations you can go into to do role play, but actually text-based role play where you just set up an app where students can text their contributions in, you give them a little brief by text, they can text in, you know, their contribution, what they want to say in that role. They can work incredibly well. And actually text, as you will know, Stephen, supports students that may have linguistic challenges, they may have cognitive differences that mean live interaction doesn't work very well for them, but give them half an hour to think about it and they'll come up with something amazing and they'll write it. So I think we have a duty to kind of expose ourselves to some of these ideas that are coming from some of the cutting edge technologies, like paper prototyping with coding, but then to take those back into contexts where, okay, that resource may not be there, but we have to resource ourselves to understand what is coming at us from people who do have those resources. And we can only do that if we're thinking in parallel ways. And that doesn't mean we have to have access to all the tools. It means we have to have access to the consciousness, the understanding of what those tools and media can do, of how powerful they are, and what kind of forms are available to us that maybe are less resourced.
Thank you, Helen. Any more questions? I can entertain just one more. And Helen, there are a lot of positive comments in the chat space. One says, a very thought-provoking and discourse-packed presentation. Thank you, Helen. The other one says, totally impressive. We are all talking about the fourth industrial revolution in South Africa without a real understanding of it. Thanks for a very dynamic and insightful presentation, Helen. Thanks for the recommendation, Diane. Those are the good comments in the chat space. I don't seem to see any more questions in the chat space, and I don't seem to see any hand up. So I will bring this session to an end, and let me thank you again, Helen, for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ephraim and Alan and all of the panel. It's been an honor to be here.
Thank you. I will hand over now to Alan and Jenny.
Thank you, Ephraim. Alan and I are going to share this. I'm going to start, and then Alan is going to continue, and then I'll finish. So that was a wonderful ending to our Siyaphumelela conference. Thank you very much indeed, Helen. We've come to this end of our first virtual conference. We finally had about 277 different people who participated at different times. So that's a great achievement. It has been a conference that has most certainly provided food for the heart, for the soul, and for the mind. This conference has made me cry. I'm sure it's made us all proud. It's inspired us, it's affirmed us, and it's provoked and challenged us in so many ways. The challenges put before us are things like, are we prepared to confront the big issues of racism, coloniality? Are we courageous enough to have whiteboard webinars in design thinking contexts? Are we courageous enough to start before we are ready? To understand deeply the problems we are trying to solve, including how we are part of those problems. We've been challenged to focus always on social justice in each of our contexts and to extend our university assets to the community. And now we are being challenged to think about writing as no longer the privileged medium. Our inspiration has been manifold. We were inspired by the reports of how our institutions came together to respond to the COVID disaster. We were inspired by improved success rates reported, inspired by hearing so much about different ways students are being put at the center of the endeavors, and with their voices being integrated in the design of student success initiatives. We as Siyaphumelela are affirmed to have reported how the Siyaphumelela approach was instrumental in developing holistic, data-driven, context-sensitive approaches full of care, and to hear how our student success teams have operated at high levels in the universities, and to see evidence of data being carefully disaggregated, and much, much more. But while we may feel proud and reaffirmed, there is still so much to be done, particularly as presented by our keynote speakers. So Alan is going to take over from there.
Thank you, Jenny. I think it has been an interesting journey for us this year with our keynote speakers, because previously we used to have hour-long presentations, and we had to rethink these into this way in which we had to adapt to the virtual environment. And I actually think a half an hour invited or keynote speech with discussion has given us far more depth and interesting conversations than we might have had if we were in a face-to-face environment. So there are some advantages being virtual. So if we go through some of the important points, maybe I would like to think about them in a kind of holistic way. So the student voice has come very clearly across all of this. It was part of Ntabaseng's talking about preparing students for educational challenges. It was about Sean Harper saying that we must look at positive ways to solve our very difficult problems. And Ahmed came along and then turned everything on its head for the South African system and said, oh, we need to get rid of some of the neoliberalism that's in the institutions and form, I think, a single entity that makes use of single systems to enhance everybody who wishes to go to university. Nori and Benita from ATD and DUT spoke about how students were being involved and how they were changing the way in which they thought. And Laura Rendon, sorry, made us think very much not only about the world that we live in our heads, but the soul and our bodies and our emotions are just as important. And opposite to that came Paul and Patrice with their ideas about data and how improvement science works. And what did we learn from that? Well, it's hard to do, but we've got to do it together. And Helen, you came with the same kind of message, is that we need to solve real world problems. We need to be about well-being. It needs to be about designing not just for the readers, but designing for everybody. And so if we think about all these kinds of things, what might we want to do in the future? Well, I think we need to tackle the hard parts. And the hard parts is to think about what teaching and learning is in these spaces that we live in. It is certainly not the distribution of information. How do we think about institutional work? Again, we need to break down the silos between those that think they know and those who think they don't know, with the students who do know lots of things that we don't know. So I actually think we have had a conference that has challenged us. And the question is, how do we react to these challenges? So Siyaphumelela partners, you are going to have to think about how we take this system of our network into places that might be very difficult to do. But I'm sure we have seen many examples of how people are already changing the way they teach, the way they support, and the student voices were fantastic. Thank you. Jenny.
Thank you. I'm sharing now. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Jenny.
Okay, so yes, this will change, but these were the services that we had planned, and I think some of them do actually pick up on the issues that Alan identified. So we will be having a holistic student support workshop in the course of this year. Oh, sorry, I haven't gone on to
the slide mode show. Yes, I was going to say that.
There we go. So we will be having holistic student support, a workshop there. Student advising, academic advising. There'll be a full-day workshop where I think people have already enrolled for that. We have a second session of design thinking, which could pick up some of the challenges Alan's just spoken about. We have a SASSI engagement, an engagement with SASSI by the University of the Free State, design-based research as another service, and then finally a second seminar on student success framework in an institutional. So those were ones that are already planned. Takalani has got them all sorted out with various dates, which we can confirm for you. We also have some services that are continuing. So the coaches, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, the 6 South African coaches at 9 universities, and obviously the completion at those 9 universities of the institutional capacity assessment tool. Because we're in the middle of some of the things that we thought we wanted to do in the course of our first year of membership at Siyaphumelela, and because we have had savings on account of not being face-to-face, we are wanting to extend our Siyaphumelela first year membership period. It was going to end at the 30th of June, and we want it to now continue until the 31st of December. And we will then look for members in 2022 to start at the beginning of 2022. So this does not affect the Kresge reporting of the partners. That's something different. But as far as the membership fee is concerned, that is what we would like to suggest. And I think this will also enable us to embark on a range of really interesting possibilities during this time arising from this actual conference. And so finally now, I would like to stop sharing if I can see. No, it says new share. Right, I'll continue anyway. I finally would like to thank you all very much indeed. There are lots of thank yous. Firstly, to the program developer. Alan, thank you for your tireless work in putting together this really exciting program, supported by the team, Takalani, Ephraim, Fatima. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank all the presenters and the chairs and the support teams around each presenter. Craig and Donovan, thank you for your calm, your systematic and really helpful ways. Without you guys, we would not have been able to get through this. Alan, thank you for fielding those inevitable tech questions about people not being able to register because, well, they hadn't paid, or in some cases, their connectivity was down. And also to the Achieving the Dream and the Kresge Foundation. And before we close, I would just like to say to all of you, please be careful out there. Other provinces don't want to go the way of Gauteng. Keep your distance, wear your mask, wash your hands, take care of yourselves, and remember, in good Siyaphumelela spirit, take care of all of those around you. Thank you.
May I just continue some of the thanks? I want to thank the tireless work by all the teams and thank Marilla for standing in when some of the bumps happened. I also want to just make a comment about the two entertaining evenings we had. I thought the paper making one was a really interesting way of people working together with paper and smiling and being able to do things. Last night we had 6 musicians playing, creating music through coding and mathematical understanding of music, which was for me a really interesting experience to see people making music through mathematics, basically what they were doing. And I then want to just finish to say to everybody who helped, especially our coaches, thank you very much for all the hard work you've done to keep us on time and to make the conference move at a nice, steady pace. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Jenny. Just one word. We will be requesting all conference participants to complete an evaluation form, and Craig will share the link to that form with all participants, and I think we'll also circulate it through their emails. Thank you.
So we say bye-bye.
There is the link in the chat space.
Ephraim, can we also send it to people for those who haven't joined this last session?
Yes, Craig is going to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.